Great to be here. So I'm a researcher with the Behavioural Research Unit at the ESRI. The unit is headed up by Pete Lunn, who was originally scheduled to speak here today. He sends his apologies for not being able to make it. I know some of you have seen him speak before. I think I'll be doing well if I can convey even a fraction of his enthusiasm for the kind of work that we do. But Pete asked me to speak today about some of the behavioural studies that we've done on environmental habits and actions. Before I start out, I just want to point out that by habits, I don't just mean the behaviours that we engage in every day, but also the way in which we get used to processing information, so the habitual way that we process information that we experience in the world. So that's important to point out because today I want to convince you of two things. The first is that the way information is presented to you matters, that even incredibly subtle presentational features of information can influence the choices that we make and ultimately our behaviours. The second is that methods from behavioural science can inform how the context has influenced our choices, and if a problem arises, it can provide us with tools to test the solutions to those problems. Okay, I'm going to start off pretty uncontroversially and say that the choices we make have implications for our health and the environment. So natural ones being the food we choose to eat or the mode of transport that we choose to travel by naturally affect both. Today we've heard quite a bit on how it's important to inform people of the kind of actions they might take to mitigate against climate change or to protect their health in order to adapt to climate change, or even the sorts of decisions that are made at policymaker level. If you want to do this effectively and bring about these changes effectively, it's important to understand the role that the context can have on the decisions that people make. So to give you a very simple but well-cited example of this, imagine after this conference you decide to go to the cinema. You're deciding how much popcorn you're going to get. There's a small popcorn option for €3 and a large one for €7. Unless you're particularly hungry, you might think €7 is a bit much to spend on popcorn, so most people in this case will opt for the small one. But say instead there's a medium option available that's priced at $6.50. So suddenly now the large popcorn starts to look like it's a pretty good value. Studies that have been done on this exact choice set show that when you introduce this middle option, many more people will opt for the €7 large popcorn deal. So essentially, the context here, which orthodox economic theory would say that if you introduce a third option that people don't find appealing, it shouldn't influence how you evaluate the other two options. In this case, you have people who are now willing to pay more either to eat more calories than they originally wanted to or contribute to food waste. So in psychology and behavioural economics, this is called the decoy effect, and it's one of a whole host of biases and effects that describe the way in which the context can influence our decisions. So the decoy effect is over here. The tiny font should give you some indication of the sheer number of ways in which the context can influence the choices that we make. So this is where behavioural science comes in. So if you have a policy problem, typically you have two aims if you want to apply behavioural science. One of them is diagnostic. You want to see, is there a problem here? Is one of these biases at play? How is it happening? What are the contexts or situations in which it's coming about? The second aim might be to pre-test the solution. So if you're aware that there is a problem and you're a bit uncertain about how to solve it, behavioural science can be used to say, okay, is this approach going to be effective? So there's a few different methods you can adopt in order to achieve these aims. One of them is to run a field trial, not always in fields, although my example will be related to fields. And these occur in the everyday real-world environment in which people make choices and behave. Typically, these are large in scale, so you can imagine if you want to try combat the decoy effect in cinemas, that you might run trials in cinemas all around the country and see, is there ways that you can present that information differently to help people not eat so much popcorn or waste so much popcorn. The aim here is usually to run it as a randomized control trial in which people are randomly assigned to see one of your interventions or to see things as normal. So the idea here is that if this is done purely randomly, that there's no pre-existing differences between the groups that you can compare, and then you can attribute any differences to the intervention or the policy that you're testing. Second method you might adopt is a lab experiment. So in this case, you'll test people's decisions in a highly controlled setting. Typically, these are smaller in scale, and often the tasks can be a bit more artificial and involve hypothetical choices. But the idea here is to precisely identify and measure the kind of psychological processes that are at play that might be influencing people's decisions outside of the lab. Or you might run a mix. Okay, so you might test, for example, real behavior in the lab. So I'm going to give you an example of one of each of these that we've run. I'm going to go against all my natural instincts as a researcher and skim over the details. Very happy to talk about those details afterwards if anyone's interested. Okay, so for our first field trial, I mentioned this is actually related to fields, so this is for the Department of Agriculture, who are issuing notices to farmers who exceeded their nitrogen emission limits. Okay, you can see here this is the standard letter that was sent out. There's quite a lot of information here. It starts out explaining the regulations to them, letting them know that they're in breach and so on. And our aim here was to see if we could decrease the number of reoffences the next year. Okay, so this was run as a randomized control trial. Farmers were randomly assigned to see either the standard letter or one of 3 alternative letters. Okay, so the first one we tested was behaviourally informed. It was simplified, and we made the key messages more salient. So this is the new letter that was sent out. You can see it's much shorter. It starts off with, we regret to inform you that our records show you're in breach of the regulations. It informs them of the penalty. And then they're strongly advised to not breach the regulations in the subsequent year. So obviously there's a lot more information taken out of this letter that was on the previous one, but this has all just been moved to the back page. So all that important information is still there, but this first page has the important stuff. On our second alternative letter, it was, again, the same simplified and behaviourally informed letter, but it also included a social norm manipulation. So a social norm manipulation essentially tells people what everyone else is doing. In this case, it was the percentage of farmers in your county who are not in breach of the regulations. So the international literature shows that these social norms tend to be quite strong, that we like to follow the herd, no pun intended. That was not intentional. And typically we don't like to be the odd one out. I can give you a bit of a spoiler here that this doesn't seem to apply too much in Ireland, that we don't seem to care too much that everyone else is following the rules. Our third letter then was included this social norm manipulation, but it also had an action box telling people exactly what they needed to do. Okay, so what did we find? If you were sent the standard letter that was issued by the department, about 34% of those farmers reoffended in the subsequent year. If you received one of our letters, you were less likely to reoffend. So the absolute percentage point difference here doesn't look too striking, but it essentially represents a change in habitual behaviour here of about 1 in 6 farmers. What you'll notice here is that the social norm didn't have any effect beyond the simplification, and neither did the action box. So kind of what that stresses is the importance of simplifying information, or those presentational changes can have on behaviour above what we might expect from other research. And recent data that we have suggests that this change in behaviour was sustained, so that if you received this letter in 2015, you were also less likely to reoffend in 2016 and 2017 as well. Okay, so I'm going to move from the field now to the lab. And this is an experiment that we did that was funded by the EPA, and it's on eco-labelling. So some of you might have heard some young people in the Dáil talk about this during the week. So essentially, we're all probably aware in this room that the grocery products you decide to purchase have implications both for the environment as well as your health and so on. And it's becoming more and more common for people to suggest that environmental labels should be put on these to communicate the impact to you. But when you're going to doing a shop, typically, so you might do this after a long day at work, you have other things on your mind, you might be under time pressure, you're in a bit of a rush and so on. And when you're doing this also, you have to take into account many different attributes of the product. So you're considering the price, the quality, is the quality difference between these two things worth the price difference and so on. So in psychology, we'd say this is a highly cognitively demanding task. There's a high level of cognitive load here. So if you want to add in some environmental information as well, although labeling might seem straightforward, the sort of decision-making context and the psychological processes that are at play are far from simple. So you have a lot of different information here you can include, like is it biodegradable, is it recyclable, the carbon footprint over the manufacturer, and so on. So what we wanted to do in this experiment was to test, is there ways that you can apply these labels more effectively to grocery products? So essentially we had people come into the lab and take part in a hypothetical shopping task that looked like one of these online shopping tasks. So you could go to the fruit and vegetable aisle, for example, and check out some apples. And in this task, so people were either free to engage with this as they would with their own shop and choose the product that they would prefer, or they were instructed to purchase specific products. So they could be instructed, for example, to buy fish that was environmentally friendly and healthy, or a sandwich that was cheap, and so on. Importantly, what we varied here was how some of this information was conveyed to people. So here I'm going to highlight the environmental impact information. So it's either communicated to people on this sort of coloured scale that you can see is quite simple and is standardised across different products, or some variable specific information was given. So for example here that it's from the top 15% of energy efficient services nationally. So the logic behind these two tests is that in one case you have this quite simple information that people can get quite quickly, but in the other case people tend to trust this variable specific information a bit more. It's also harder for companies to fudge the variable specific information because they need it to be factual. And this is what's applied to some of the food labels in the US. What we varied as well to get at that sort of element of you going for your shop after work or being in a bit of a rush is that some people, in some conditions, people did this at their own pace, and in other cases they did it under time pressure. So there's a time limit applied to how long they had to do this task. Okay, so what did we find? So I'm just going to show you here, essentially a higher bar will indicate that people were choosing products that were better, for example, on the environmental attributes and so on. So in these dark green bars, we have that specific verbal information. You can see people chose slightly worse products when they were under time pressure, but there was no difference here for those coloured scales. So essentially the scale display helped people here choose more environmentally friendly products. When we compare it to the other attributes, you can see that difference doesn't really exist for information about how healthy the food was. So one possibility here is that people are just more habitually used to processing information about the quality of the food and so on, but environmental information is something new. So the implication here is that these coloured scales might be useful for people to get used to evaluating the environmental impacts of their grocery products. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to a mixed experiment. So this is real behaviour in the lab, and this experiment was funded by the Department of Health. And it's on legislation, proposed legislation to apply calories to restaurant menus. Okay, so similar to before, the international literature here shows that colour-coded labels are effective for people to evaluate how many calories are in something. But from a policy perspective, this is quite difficult to implement. It's difficult to mandate restaurants to print something in colour on their menus. So what we're interested in testing here is from the psychology of order effects. So know that the order in which people process information is important. So if you take, for example, first impressions, the first impression you get from someone tends to be overweighted, and other bits of information that come in, it's difficult to override that first impression. Okay, one challenge though with carrying out a real behaviour experiment on food choice is that if people are aware that you're interested in the food they're choosing, they might be likely to choose something else. So what we had here was people come into the lab to take part in a series of different studies. At the end of the first study they took part in was a consumer evaluation task, so they were presented with products, and we had this little machine here underneath the screen, that's an eye tracker. It's completely non-invasive, but it can tell from the angle of your pupil essentially exactly where you're looking at the screen. So they're aware that was running for the first experiment. They're also aware they were going to get their lunch in exchange for taking part. So at the end of the first experiment, there was thanked for completing it, and they said they could now order their lunch on us by following the link below to the ESRI's intranet catering, which only existed for the purpose of this experiment. So people then proceeded to our restaurant menu. These were from a salad shop that was nearby, a Subway as well, and a pizza place. So there's a whole range of calorie options they could choose from, and the eye tracker was running as people made this decision. So some people saw the restaurant menu as normal, so there's no calories here. Some people saw the calories to the left of the price, so that it read food, calories, price. And some people saw it to the right of the price, so that it read food, price, and calories. And that's essentially the important manipulation here. So people had a voucher as well, so they had €8 to spend, and they could choose a main and sides and a drink and so on. So there was that trade-off there between price and the food that you can purchase. So now usually when Pete does this experiment or presents this, he tries to get some engagement with the audience. So can we get a show of hands for people who think calories will firstly be effective? Okay, and if you think calories will be more effective on the left of the price, so that it reads food, calories, price. And for calories on the right of the price. Okay, so roughly there, I think about 2/3 thought calories to the left of the price. That's exactly what Deirdre and Pete thought. They recently presented this at a conference that was for health policy experts. You can tell where I'm going with this. And we were all wrong. So essentially, the calories that were ordered here, so on average, people ordered about just under 900 calories, which if you compare that to the recommended daily allowance, it's quite a lot for lunch. The calories on the menu seem to make a bit of a difference, but this is completely driven by calories being to the right of the price. We also have some estimates of how much calorie they ate, or how many calories they ate. This is from weighing their food beforehand and subsequently taking it out of the bin and weighing it again afterwards. And here we see a similar pattern, that people were eating less when calories were to the right of the price. From that eye tracker data, you can see here, so these are essentially heat maps, where the more red it is, the more people looked at that information. You can see they sort of skimmed past the calorie information when it was to the left of the price, but they factored it in more so when it was to the right of the price. So one possibility here is that the habitual way we process information when ordering food is to read the description of the food on the left, and then you scan immediately across to the end of it to see how much it costs. So now there's calorie information here that was being factored in. Of course, this is very easy to appreciate with hindsight, but beforehand we all thought it was going to be, you couldn't skim past it if it was in the middle. Okay, so to sum up that calorie posting experiment, people who saw it on the right, they ordered less, they ate less, they knew more about how much they ate, they gave greater weight to the calorie information, they looked at lower calorie options more often, they looked at a higher proportion of calories to price information, and importantly, they enjoyed their lunch just as much as the other crowd. Okay, so that's just a whirlwind overview of 3 of the experiments we've done for 3 of our different funders. We do work with a whole host of other state bodies and government departments. There's plenty of other programs I could have spoken about today that are relevant for this conference. So we're amassing quite a body of research now for the EPA, so I could have spoken about presenting fuel efficiency information of cars, framing pollution regulation, getting people to test for radon in high-risk areas. And we have a new research program coming up down the bottom that's relevant for some of the talks that that were spoken about today. So hopefully we get to talk about these next year, hopefully. So this is on how well Irish people understand climate change, and importantly, is understanding actually linked to your willingness to support and make change. Okay, so to summarize what I've said, I hope to have convinced you that even incredibly subtle features of the way in which information is presented to us can influence our choices, that methods from behavioural science can be used in order to inform how contexts influence our choices and to test solutions when a problem arises. And I'm going to be a bit cheeky here and add in a third one to say that uncertainty is important. Uncertainty is important from the policy perspective, that if you're willing to embrace that uncertainty, you can be willing to test it. In the case of the calorie posting experiment, health policy experts tend to have agreed with us that on the left would have been more effective, but now we can see that it wouldn't have been. It's also important for us to embrace uncertainty. We rarely know exactly what's going to work. We try to inform ourselves with the other research that's done and done internationally, but you can see, for example, with that social norm manipulation, not everything applies in an Irish context. So that's why we like to test what we do. Okay, so there's more information on these papers and the other programs we have at esri.ie/BRU, or if anyone would like specific details, my email address is there as well. Thank you very much.